give me, no, it's not a rhetorical question for politely saying you are an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about. It's simply, I would like to know give me some names and so on, and who are these postmodern, egalitarian, neo-Marxist, and where do you see any kind even of Marxism? Please, I'm so sorry that I was too long.
That's no problem. Please. Well, I mean, organization like Jonathan Haidt's, what's it called?
Well, it happened. Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Žižek had their debate. In this video, I'll present a short excerpt from Eliot Rosenstock's book, Žižek in the Clinic, along with some thoughts on that debate and the left's reaction to it. But before we get to the left's response, before we critique the critique, let's put the whole thing in context. Slavoj Žižek doesn't need Peterson. What I mean by that is that when Zizek wrote about Peterson, he did so in his usual way. In the same way that he might have written about a Batman movie. Further, though, he doesn't need Peterson the way a jealous husband might need a cheating wife. That is, that Peterson is not any part of his internal self. He doesn't need the problem of Peterson in order to create his own project.
You have job?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what. Say that again.
7-Eleven app.
No, I don't have the 7-Eleven app. No. To explain this idea of the jealous husband who needs his wife to cheat, I'll read you a slightly revised quote from a Žižek essay entitled Jacques Lacan's Four Discourses. Quote, recall Lacan's outrageous statement that even if what a jealous husband claims about his wife, that she sleeps around with other men, is all true, his jealousy is still pathological. Along the same lines, one could say that even though most of the current left's claims about the right are true, they are racist, they are misogynist, they're ignorant and self-interested, their leaders like Trump and Bolsonaro are narcissistic idiots who undermine democratic values, the left's hysteria about the right is still pathological because it represses the true reason the left needs a right-wing enemy in order to sustain its ideological position. Why does the left need a right-wing enemy in order to sustain its ideological position? I'll maybe return to that question. But in the meantime, let's shift our example. The jealous husband uses his unfaithful wife as an excuse for his own failures, either his sexual failures or his other failures. The cultural conservative, likewise, needs a group of maybe godless, definitely smug, always urban liberals or leftists in order to maintain his understanding of himself as a defender of traditional values, romantic myths, and the idea of a harmoniously functioning cultural order that he might return to. Without a liberal scapegoat, the cultural conservative would have to examine not only how he participates in the destruction of his old traditional culture, for instance, how his economic values might be in opposition to his cultural preferences, but may lead him even to question whether he understands what this old traditional culture was or might be. He might be forced to ask whether he really wants to return to it at all. This notion of the paranoid husband whose jealousy is pathological even though his wife really is cheating on him is crucial if we're to understand what Žižek was aiming to accomplish, to what I would say he did accomplish during his debate with Peterson. And I think realizing this helps put the criticism Žižek has received from the left into a perspective as well. Let's take Benjamin Studebaker's piece in Current Affairs to start with. He, predictably enough, started off by rating the debate as if it were a pop song, by comparing it to Foucault versus Chomsky, for example. He critiqued it in terms of form. He objected that Žižek, for instance, hadn't properly addressed Peterson's argument in his opening presentation. This isn't very different from objecting to a singer for missing a note, or even more accurately, to objecting that there's no recognizable refrain in an ambient work by Brian Eno. The opening presentations didn't immediately appear to connect, but this was the result of the debate being between two figures from disparate domains, and also a strategic choice by Žižek. Žižek didn't let Peterson set the terms or the frame for the argument, but rather provided his own theoretical framework and his own thoughts and set them in opposition to Peterson's ideas. Studebaker goes on from there to offer his own critique of Peterson's argument against Marx, to refute Peterson's critique of the Communist Manifesto, and to provide his own analysis and summary of the significance of Marx, which is a fine thing in itself. It's worthwhile to think through all the ways Peterson went wrong in his opening argument. But when evaluating Žižek's performance, we should ask ourselves why Žižek didn't opt for this approach. Studebaker answers this question for us, even though he doesn't appear to recognize what he wrote to be an answer. Here's what he wrote. Quote, Žižek didn't push Peterson to talk about the intricacies of Marxist and socialist theory, and Peterson didn't appear to have done the reading that would be necessary for him to produce an interesting conversation about them. End quote. All Žižek would have accomplished by taking Peterson apart on the level that Studebaker did was demonstrate that Žižek had done his homework while Peterson had not. This was established a bit later on anyway, quickly and efficiently, and it wasn't belabored. The point wasn't to humiliate Peterson, but to win over the audience. A bit more interesting than the current affair piece is the piece in Jacobin. While Harrison Fluss and Sam Miller also begin by doing what Žižek didn't bother to do, namely explicating the depth of Peterson's ignorance in regards to Marx, they went on to critique Žižek in some interesting ways. Their criticism of Žižek mostly amounted to a laundry list of assertions. According to the two authors, Žižek had the right opinions on some issues and the wrong ones on some others, but they didn't bother to fully explicate Žižek's opinions. They seemed to think that because Žižek's politics were not identical to their own, that the whole debate could be dismissed. Overall, I think the left would do well to take a bit of Jordan Peterson's advice.
You don't want to teach him to win. You want to teach him to play well with others. And that's to be reciprocal. So that means to try to win, but also to pay attention to developing the other people around him and not to put winning the game above everything at all times. So then he's fun to play with.
Žižek's performance at this debate was pretty much pitch perfect. He didn't get flustered, he didn't hector or belittle Peterson or his fans, but rather managed to demonstrate that there are leftists with interesting things to say while exposing Peterson's limits and advocating for the need for radical change and a break from capitalism. That doesn't mean that there aren't reasons to be critical of Žižek or the things he said during the debate. I'd be very interested in exploring Žižek's charge that Marx's vision is ultimately a technocratic one. That said, being critical has to involve understanding the meaning of your interlocutor's ideas. And when Fluss and Miller wrote that Žižek, quote, came off as a technocratic liberal himself, since for him the masses are incapable of achieving freedom for themselves and that they needed some kind of master to guide them, they were misreading him and being uncharitable and really naive. The notion of the master, or the master signifier from Lacan, is a complex one, having to do with mediating our relationship with the world, but they recast that idea here as Žižek's embrace of authoritarianism rather than his embrace of what he thinks to be a necessary form of authority, like a universal kind of authority. Still, Fluss's claim that Žižek and Peterson both affirmed the existence of class society, social hierarchy, and an inescapable fate of suffering may well be half right. I tend to agree that Žižek has abandoned the idea of creating a classless society, but I disagree that such a society would have no remaining social hierarchies and would eliminate suffering. Longtime listeners and viewers of this channel might recall that when I had a chance to interview Žižek, I specifically pressed him on the question of whether he thought Marx's core concepts from Capital, namely the primacy of labor time under capitalism, was correct. And I found that the Slovenian psychoanalysts, like a great many other Marxists, had abandoned the concept. It seemed to me that abandoning this concept of labor leads naturally to abandoning the goal of creating a classless social order. From my way of thinking, then, Žižek isn't a Marxist. But from my way of thinking, a great many luminaries and revolutionaries from the Marxist tradition aren't Marxists either. The point isn't who is a Marxist, but rather, can we develop our understanding in politics? And right now, the point is, did this debate help us in that endeavor? I think it did. When I think about the event now, the Peterson-Žižek confrontation, it seems to me that more than a debate, it was a psychoanalytic intervention. Žižek set out to remove Peterson's symptom, to dispel the mythical figure of the postmodern neo-Marxist. And I think he succeeded. But where does that leave Peterson? Where will he go now? What will he say? Will he continue to talk about these folk demons? To blame society's ills on college campuses and neo-Marxists? And if so, won't it seem hollow now that he's been through this psychoanalytic experience? And what about Žižek? What about his symptom? The symptom of, let's call it multicultural, politically correct, liberal pseudo-revolution. What would he do if that figure, if that symptom were to be dispelled? What would he talk about? In his book, Žižek in the Clinic, Eliot Rosenstock wrote that, quote, in an ironic twist, Žižek's view of himself not being taken seriously as a philosopher may be not only accurate, but directly caused by his function as a kind of cultural therapist. Žižek relays information to the general public about dialectical processing and psychoanalysis until the general public can interpret their own motivations and processing of information better than the void of the other, Žižek himself. End quote. I think this is the core of it. Žižek can provide people with an introduction to the various contradictions and problems in society. He can help people of many different persuasions and with many different psychological symptoms figure out their situation. At this debate with Peterson, he surely did this. Even Peterson himself seemed to be forced into moments of openness, where he had to reconsider his position. But these moments of openness have to include movement. They have to lead to making decisions and to our thinking for ourselves. At times, inevitably, that will mean disagreeing with Žižek. You want me to tell you about my mother? If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.